Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Andrea English, and I will be chairing the talk today. We are excited to present our 7th and final talk in our virtual visiting speaker series on decolonizing the curriculum in higher education, which has been a 7-talk series over the past 6 months. The topic of decolonizing the curriculum is gaining increasing attention worldwide. As you know, if you've been part of any of this series so far, I think since we started in January, even more attention has been drawn to this topic with additional policy discourse and teachers and students trying to make changes in their own context, which is very exciting. In this series, we've invited speakers who can help us collectively reflect on the meaning of decolonization and in turn inspire us and aid our existing efforts to make changes in our own educational contexts. It's my great honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Penny Enslin. Professor Enslin joined the School of Education in Glasgow as chair in education and director of the Ed-D program in 2006. From the University of, she came originally from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, where she's also emeritus professor in the School of Education there. At Wits University, she served as head of the Department of Education and as deputy dean of the Faculty of Education and the Faculty of Humanities. Before joining Wits University, she taught history and religious instruction in secondary schools in Johannesburg. Her recent publications include Monuments After Empire, which was in 2020 in the Journal of Philosophy of Education, and also a co-authored publication, Rethinking the Western Tradition, in a Routledge book entitled The Dilemma of Western Philosophy, as well as Post-Colonialism and Education, Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Education, and much, much more. I highly encourage you to look at her website for more details. We're very excited for her talk today, and it is entitled Decolonizing Higher Education, the University in the New Age of Empire. So Penny, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for your welcome, Andrea, and for inviting me to speak to this very important theme. I'm going to share my screen with you. So my title is Decolonizing Higher Education, the University in the New Age of Empire. And I'm responding to the call for the decolonization of the curriculum in higher education by taking a slightly different look at the issues at stake. In summary, there are 2 moves that I want to make. The first is that I agree there are compelling reasons why we should decolonize the curriculum in higher education, but depending on what this means. However, I'm arguing too that decolonizing higher education and its institutions has wider implications that we need to take into account as we address the history and consequences of colonialism, but also new forms of empire. It's important to start from a context because of how big and variable the issues at stake are. So I'm going to take Scotland as my starting point, and to observe that Scotland played a significant role in the British Empire and in colonialism. I'm speaking to you from a school of education in an ancient Scottish university. And of course, as we all know, Britain was, if anything, the primary colonial power in the modern age of empire. Scots played quite a prominent role in creating that empire as explorers, traders, soldiers, administrators, teachers, doctors, and settlers. some of them my ancestors. So from that context, let's think about colonialism and Scottish universities in particular too. Glasgow prided itself on being a city of the empire, and it benefited enormously from that empire, as we can see in magnificent buildings and other evidence across this city. And its universities did too. My own university, Glasgow, has been grappling recently, and I think to its credit, with its links with the history of slavery. Now, a few concepts before moving on. I'm taking imperialism to be about a broader concept than colonialism, about the assumptions that were held by the dominating powers over a distant or occasionally an adjacent territory. But colonialism is a more specific concept. It's more modern, and it's about the control, exploitation, and often settlement of a conquered, distant territory. I've been scolded recently by an old academic colleague who's urged me to talk less about post-colonialism and more about decoloniality and decolonization. But I do want to insist on the importance of reflecting on the post-colonial and post-colonial thought, and to identify two streams that are going to figure in what I have to say about post-colonial theory. One of these is about culture and the sense of self and how destructive colonialism has been in many parts of the world in that respect. But I also want to emphasize the economic and the political. A few initial assumptions about higher education. It's a public good. It's good for its own intrinsic worth and for the benefits it brings. In other words, knowledge, understanding, employment, widened opportunities to participate, and for other reasons. And the complication is that universities have been imbricated in imperialism and in colonialism. There are many examples, but one I would mention is that in some cases in colonized countries, the very land that universities stand on is land that was taken from indigenous inhabitants. And crucial to what I want to argue is that coloniality endures and it evolves, including in higher education. Now, I don't intend this question to be a naive one, but let's take stock of why colonialism was unjust. And it was multiply unjust. In the taking of land, in appropriation of resources in colonized countries, in forcing their inhabitants to trade on unequal terms with the colonizing power, and very crucially for education, in the kinds of cultural domination that colonialism created and perpetuated. I want to acknowledge the importance here of race and slavery as a major feature of colonialism, its injustice, and as we know from recent events in the UK and elsewhere, in the ongoing attempts to recognize and to deal with the consequences of slavery and the racist assumptions that went together with justifying by the colonialists on their part why it was acceptable to occupy foreign parts of the world and to dominate their inhabitants. Colonialism also involved very crucially the exploitation of labor, and overall its injustice was very crucially simply a form of alien rule. Now, on the subject of cultural domination, Thomas Macaulay is often quoted in this extract from his infamous minute on Indian education as making a kind of observation about the West and its assumed superiority. And it always shocks one to read this quotation, no matter how many times I look at it, for its dismissiveness, its racist stereotyping, and the sheer ignorance that Macaulay demonstrated in making this observation. I'll return to Macaulay later though, but he sums up, I think, and leads in naturally into the next issue that I want to take note of, and that is he sums up an approach to colonial education. He was instrumental in establishing English as a language of education in India, of course. So colonial education was marked by its dismissiveness of the indigenous, and it was European in languages, knowledge, approaches to moral education. It was intended and set up and managed to meet the needs of the colonizers, not of the inhabitants of the countries that were colonized. And it was limited in provision. It was intended to produce workers who would support the needs of the colonizers and of their administrations. For example, clerks to support the administration in India. And infamously, in some contexts, as we know from recent reports coming from Canada, but also this happened in other countries, it involved removing children from their parents and their communities, which was, as we know, immensely destructive, even to the point of some children dying while being held in boarding schools. Now, many of us rely on the idea of Orientalism in analyzing and understanding, trying to understand the processes which I've been summarizing. Admittedly, I've generalized, but summarizing in thinking about colonialism and its significance. And Edward Said's Orientalism has been immensely influential, I think, in our thinking about empire and colonialism, and in giving us some crucial concepts, particularly that of Orientalism, and of summarizing the way in which Orientalism, and documenting it and examining the kinds of acts that took place in Orientalist behavior, creating and managing a set of assumptions about the Orient. And of course, Orientalism doesn't only apply to the Orient, it was a disposition towards people in many parts of the empire. Now, I think that Said's particular brand of post-structuralist analysis has been so influential that I'm calling his work part of the post-colonial canon, in the way in particular that he drew on post-structuralist concepts to explore further the relationship between knowledge and power, the idea of othering, and in general the role of Western disciplines in Orientalism. Now at this point, having pointed to Said's work as part of what is now a post-colonial canon, I want to return to an observation that I hinted at earlier on, which is that there are two narratives at play in analyses and debates about colonialism. The one which comes very strongly from Said himself, but we see it also very influentially in the writings of Gandhi and of Fanon, places an emphasis on the self and on identity, on the psychological damage of colonialism and the importance of psychological resistance, that the post-colonial or anti-colonial struggle has been about demanding recognition and engaging in processes of self-recovery. And one can see that education must be relevant to those kinds of endeavors. But the other is the Marxist critique of colonialism, a very ambiguous one, but also a Marxist critique of post-colonialist authors who emphasize culture and identity and self so strongly. And of course, for a Marxist, colonialism was about imposing capitalism on indigenous people by colonial powers. In other words, from this angle, colonialism was about appropriating and growing wealth. It was about taking resources, developing trade and profiting from it. It was about commodity production for a market system, and it involved drawing all into class relations. I think it's crucial that we hold on to both of those perspectives in reflecting on what decolonization might be about. Thinking back to colonialism and colonial education again, and viewing both colonial injustice and post-colonial injustice from perspective of quite a number of possible theories that have been developed during the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, in attempting to understand what was the injustice about, what were its features, how can we best understand it, and what contemporary theories of justice can be the most illuminating and most helpful in trying to think about post-colonial action. Now, for some of us, of these four possibilities on this slide, distributive justice is the most obvious. And clearly, colonial exploitation was about distribution of goods in an unjust way, ensuring that by the end of the era of colonialism, even after political decolonization or formal decolonization had taken place, the distribution of goods has been extremely unfair, but also, and I'm alluding very quickly to the kind of Rawls tradition of justice as fairness, in response to which, furthermore, theories of justice which have emphasized the importance of recognition are clearly also very important to thinking about the post-colonial condition and what would be appropriate action in that condition. Demands for recognition of identity of the local and of marginalized traditions and cultures. And it's, to state the obvious perhaps in a way, the Black Lives Matter campaign is clearly an expression of a demand for justice in the form of recognition, and recognition of various kinds and levels of injustice. But also, while thinking back to Macaulay, we can see his statement about the literatures he didn't know or understand as a massive failure of recognition, but also a failure of misrepresentation, and hence thinking about post-colonial justice now, trying to achieve justice in representation and hence also in participation needs to be crucial to how we think through the problems and what would be appropriate action. But I'm asking my question here again. Is it cultural or economic? Well, clearly the answer is both. But I do have a concern about the first of the two tending to be overemphasized on occasion at the expense of the second. So I referred a few minutes ago briefly to the fact of formal decolonization, and it happened quite quickly in the era after the Second World War. Over several decades, a large number of colonies achieved political independence. And that was independence from an era in which apparently as much as 80% of the global population had been brought into the embrace, if that's what it was, of the colonial powers. But let's just have a look at one example of evidence of persisting coloniality. And I'm referring here, going back to my context and those of several others who are present this afternoon, of Scotland and how in Scottish education we think about how to be post-colonial. This alludes, of course, to Scotland's ties with Malawi as a former British colony. And I think that what's in evidence here, apart from the fact that educational systems in general remained little changed after independence, is the huge difference on the Human Development Index ranking between the UK and Malawi, with significant differences in life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, and in gross national income per capita. That makes possibilities for any kind of equality across the globe very starkly obvious. The continuing effects of coloniality are enormous. Now, moving towards thinking about the context in which those of us employed in higher education work. Globalization is a key element in understanding how neo-colonialism continues the tradition and the influence of imperialism and colonialism in the contexts in which we are trying to educate and to make our contribution. And in particular, to state the obvious, we're all aware of how neoliberal influences in our work have become globalized, so that the very understandings of knowledge and what it's for are determined by commodification, by measurement and valuing the things we do in a very particular way. Our curriculum and our pedagogy are heavily influenced by neo-colonialism and the effects of globalization, the way that we organize educational systems, the schools, the universities, and the way that we assess pupils and students. Supranational bodies are enormously influential across the globe in educational systems, in influencing how we think about what we do, how we assess whether we're doing it well. And all of these influences must be recognized as, if anything, an intensification of coloniality. And in my view, we all need to be troubled about new forms of coloniality in universities. When we think about colonialism and how to address its injustices, various aspects of the regimes that govern higher education policy and the way that our institutions conduct themselves are enormously unjust and mean that achieving anything near forms of equality in education across the globe are very unlikely. And I think in particular of the ways in which we pursue what we call internationalization, where international students and their fees in British universities are a form of income. They are there for profit. They develop our campuses. And there are serious questions to ask about whether students who come to British universities from across the globe are, among other things, getting value for the huge amounts of money they pay. Now, I understand how this came about and how university funding formulae have changed over the decades. And one particular thing I think is extremely unjust, and that is to expect students who come to universities in the UK from former colonies, which are relatively poor compared with the UK and its prosperity, to expect them and or their governments to pay exorbitant fees seems to me to be an indefensible form of a new coloniality. Now this brings me to this concept of empire that I introduced at the beginning, and it's there in the title of this talk. There are various theorists who now use the term empire, and I think we can trace this back as a contemporary concept to analyze current global conditions, to the work of Hart and Negri at the beginning of the 21st century, in which they describe what they call empire, and it's a very dispersed and different kind of empire. They attach it to what they call the global market and global circuits of production. Those features of globalization that I summarized a few minutes ago. So who has the power now in this new age of empire? Obviously, global corporations are big wielders of power. And we see how examples only recently of attempts by governments to get some of these big tech giants to pay a fair tax as evidence of the kind of power that they carry, and of how rulemaking is something that these corporations do themselves. In many ways, they are beyond the control and the influence of any national governments. Nonetheless, it's clear in the international system that the former and new colonial powers, and I am thinking here of governments, tend to call the shots internationally in changing forms of domination, that international agreements, while often the result of consultation with some of the more marginalized and less prosperous countries, the big former colonial powers, with the addition probably of China and Russia, are the ones who call the shots and who dominate many of the activities, economic and otherwise, across the globe. Furthermore, I would say that a feature of empire, as it is now, has to be recognized as, if anything, growing inequalities between states. It's not that, as might have been hoped after political decolonization, there could have been a gradual process of former colonized powers growing and becoming more prosperous. If anything, many, particularly since the start of the pandemic, are now suffering even greater inequalities compared with the big powers. We see this in the form of vaccine nationalism, for example. But I also want to add, and this is important, growing inequalities within states. It's not that one can generalize and say that the people of Britain today all benefit from this country's history of empire. That is clearly not the case. That empire, as it was in the age of colonization, and empire now increasingly benefits a minority, and there are growing numbers of citizens in countries like Britain who are marginalized, who have not and may never have benefited from the imperial and colonial age. One of my critical worries is that in our tendency to look backwards and to look at the more sensational but shocking and unacceptable consequences of empire, we ignore the way in which empire shifts and changes. We ignore the increasingly dispersed ways in which power and domination are exercised over others. And it's crucial that we recognize what Puri has called the great imperial hangover. So to move, I hope, towards some conclusions. In previous discussions, some of the language of decolonization has been reflected on. I'm thinking of Dominic's presentation, among others. There's an extensive vocabulary that's used in trying to describe what decolonization might involve. Decenter, provincialize. Some of these terms that I've listed here are quite similar. Some might seem to be quite modest, perhaps interrupting forms of domination might seem fairly tentative, but reversal and excision are interestingly different. And I want to take a position about what we do in choosing among these possibilities, and I'll get to that in a moment. Before I get there, though, the problem of responsibility for post-colonial justice is enormous, and I think that it influences the ways in which we can possibly think about decolonization. These injustices that I've been alluding to in this talk are structural. There's no one obvious agent we can point to. There are dilemmas in the literature about post-colonial justice that are enormous. So who should be the agents here? Does it require institutional or individual action? Well, probably both, but that's a difficult one. Is post-colonial justice to be achieved between states? For example, I think of the recent attempt by Germany to pay reparations to Namibia for its program of genocide in Namibia when it occupied Namibia before losing that colony in the peace settlement after the First World War. Is it a matter of individual action? And here, all possibilities seem to pose risks if we offer, and at the urging of Peter Singer, to make a monthly donation of a certain percentage of our incomes. Is there a danger there that our donations in some way could make things worse? Are we merely engaging in acts of charity and patronizing benevolence if we even consider those sorts of possible actions. And this is part of what I call the enormity of colonial injustice. And that influences considerations about what sort of action we might be able to take. And I'm skeptical about some tendencies towards direct action in thinking about these things. So to return to the theme of this series of talks, and this will be my last slide. How do we think about decolonizing the curriculum? What sort of decolonial action should we be undertaking? And might there be any principles or guidelines that we could follow here? So firstly, it's clear to me that we need to disrupt the legacy of colonialism in the disciplines in which we work. So that includes philosophy of education, which is my discipline and that of many of you listening today. That's the courses we teach, our journals, whose work do they publish, whose work doesn't appear very much in our journals, what are we doing to make sure that a greater range of authors and ideas appear in those journals. But I do want to defend disciplinary knowledge. In the early days of Orientalism, some people working from within disciplines like anthropology undoubtedly supported the colonial project. But many of the disciplines are now, and I think anthropologists are prominent among them, attending closely to how to decolonize that discipline. But there is a great deal to be risked in going overboard in decentering and displacing disciplinary knowledge. And by this I mean, I want to emphasize the ongoing importance of evidence, of justifying the claims we make, holding them provisionally. I'm quite happy to talk about the very idea of adequately justified true belief and of defending systems of knowledge based on reason and not mere belief. But there is room for decentering, for border crossing, for hybridity, engaging in the spaces in between traditional practices, identities, and beliefs about knowledge and the more established disciplines that have tended to dominate in Western education. So to be inclusive in universities and in their curricula, there need to be substantial moves beyond Western domination and to be aware of its history and its ongoing effects. Do we assume that international students can arrive in Scotland and know what it is when we demand that they demonstrate criticality? I'm opposing unconditional affirmation. While I advocate respectful engagement with what's called Indigenous knowledge, I think that nativism and nationalism are both a threat to criticality and that we need to defend it. And so I want to emphasize the ongoing importance of critical autonomy as an aim of education. And I like very much a description that Michael Sandel has offered of what we do when we teach philosophy, which is that it's about making the familiar strange. Now, to go back to Macaulay, the problem with Macaulay was that everybody else was strange, but Macaulay wasn't able to recognize his own strangeness. And so he was engaging in a kind of making strange, which is very far from what Sandel has been alluding to and from what I'm proposing that we need to do. So we need, I believe, in decolonizing or in engaging in decolonial action in education, to continue to make strange, but to be very sensitive and careful about recognizing our own strangeness and not rushing to identify the strangeness of others' beliefs and traditions and identities, but to hold on to the importance of complexity and ambiguity. And I want to end with, let me end provocatively by summing up and saying that I think direct action has its place in campaigning for us to reconsider the traditions we have in higher education, our buildings, our statues, the practices that can create unreasonable forms of strangeness for those who come to study with us. But my final observation before we move to discussion, and I'm going to just share a screen with a few references for a couple of minutes in case you want to note any of them, is to say to you that the curriculum is not a statue. Thank you.